everybody. Today we're going to begin our Bible study on the book of Esther, and we're starting with Esther chapter 1. So what I'm going to do is read the whole chapter and then go back and verse by verse break this down. So if you don't want to listen to me read Esther, just kind of skip forward a little bit. Esther chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel. For so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Sethar, and Carcas, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And the next unto him was Carshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti, the queen, hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes, and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard of the deed of the queen. Thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man shall bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Okay, so we know that Esther is one of 2 books in the Bible that is named after a woman. Ruth is the other book of the Bible that's named after a woman, but Ruth is not a Jew, so Esther is the only Jewish woman who has a book of the Bible named for her. Now, the book of Esther does not mention prayer or God once. The only other Old Testament book that doesn't mention God is Song of Solomon. Both books barely made it into the Bible, so Esther was only allowed to be in the Bible because when we look at the book of Esther closely, we can see that God is working behind the scenes. So, although God is never mentioned in Esther, we know that he was working through these people in really extraordinary ways, because there is no coincidence with God. The coincidence is never mentioned in the Old Testament, and there's only one time in the New Testament when Jesus says, he's talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he uses the phrase by chance. So that is the only time that the Bible even comes close to saying coincidence. So with God, there's no coincidences. As we go through Esther, we're going to see throughout the chapters that all of these things just lined up perfectly, and we know that it was God that was lining those things out. So the book of Esther takes place in the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire, the palace of Shushan. So why is Esther and the other Jews even in the Persian Empire? Because we know Esther's a Jewish woman, and why is she in Persia? So the Jews had been residing in Persia after arriving in the region as slaves. If we go back to the book of 2 Chronicles, at the end of it, it tells us that the Jews are being captured by the Assyrian and Babylonian kings. Now, they were captive in this land for 70 years. Zerubbabel leads the first exodus back to Jerusalem, but fewer than 50,000 Jews make that journey. So the book of Esther is taking place after the first exodus and before the second exodus, when all the Jews go back to Jerusalem. So let's go back to verse 1 of chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 120 provinces. So Ahasuerus is also known as King Xerxes. So most people agree that Ahasuerus is a title and not a specific name. So it would be like the leaders of Egypt were called Pharaoh, the leaders of Rome were called Caesar, the leaders of Persia are Ahasuerus. He is commonly called Xerxes based on historical records for this time. His father is thought to be Darius I, mentioned in the book of Daniel, chapter 6, verse 1, and his grandfather was Cyrus the Great. So I may say Xerxes sometimes, I may say Ahasuerus, but when we talk about Xerxes, we're talking about the same person, the king. The Medo-Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. It covered what we today call Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, parts of Egypt, Sudan, Libya, Arabia. Xerxes is known for his failure to conquer Greece. He had a reputation for harsh punishments, womanizing, being a tyrant, having great wealth. He also thought himself above the gods that the Persians worshipped. Shushan the palace. Now that is King Xerxes' winter palace. Okay, so he was known to have more than one palace, and this was his winter palace. So if we look at verses 3 through 4. Okay, so I didn't read verse 2. We talked about it as well. So let's read verses 3 through 4. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. So this whole book of Esther, you're going to see they're feasting or they're fasting. So King Xerxes made a feast for the princes and nobles to show off his riches and show off his kingdom, and that feast lasted 180 days. Now, it's thought that his purpose for this really long feast is because he was trying to gain support to go to war against Greece. So he's shown off all his wealth and all of his riches. Let's read verse 5. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So he's having another feast after his 180-day long feast. So this second feast lasts 7 days, and it was for those in the palace of Shushan, and it was held in the court of the garden. Verse 6. Where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. So this is just describing the vast wealth and the beauty of the palace. Verses 7 and 8. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel. For so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. So drinks were being served in golden goblets. There were no limits on how much they could drink. They could have as much as they wanted. Verse 9. Also, Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So, while this feast is going on, Queen Vashti is hosting the women with their own feast. Verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king. Have no clue if I'm saying those names correctly, so yeah, just take it as it is. But verse 10 says, when his heart was merry with wine. So if he was not drunk, then he was definitely close to being drunk. He was taking advantage of all the wine being offered. Verse 11 says, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. So back in verse 10, it does mention the chamberlains were the ones that were supposed to bring Queen Vashti. Now, a chamberlain is an officer who manages the household of a monarch or noble, and sometimes they were eunuchs. So that word is interchangeable in different Bible translations. Okay, now we just have to get this in our head. The king has been feasting and drinking wine for 187 days now, and he's hosting these men, these princes and nobles, and they've all been drinking, and he commands Queen Vashti to come in and show her beauty off to the men. Now, some say that it is suggested in the text that he is asking her to only come in her crown, like wearing nothing else. We're not exactly sure, but either way, he's asking her to come before these men. Now, verse 12 says, but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. So Vashti refuses the king's commandment. He is very angry. He's probably embarrassed by her refusal because he is trying to gain support from these people to go to war, and he can't even command his own wife and queen to do something. She refuses him. So I'm sure he's angry because of that embarrassment, and she just flat out denied him. Now, let's think about this a minute. And I absolutely love discussing this with the women in our Bible study group last week. We were talking about, was Vashti being disobedient or was she courageous? Because I wouldn't want to go in front of a bunch of drunk men and parade my beauty, and I'm sure she didn't either. And they were probably going to treat her unkindly. She probably did not want that attention from all of those drunken men there. And we know later on, if you're familiar with the book of Esther, we know that it is against the law to go before the king without being summoned. So it's most likely against the law to say no to the king when he is summoning you there to him. So refusing to go to the king when he demands could result in death, could result in her losing her position as queen. And again, if you're familiar with Esther, we're always so amazed by Esther's courage, and she is the epitome of courage. But her courage was that she had to go to the king without being summoned, and that could result in death. But we never hear about the courage of Vashti because she said no at the risk of losing her life, at the risk of losing her position. We have no idea what all led up to that. Was that the first time that he's asked her to do this? Had other things been going on during this 187-day feast? We have no clue. We know that she probably did not want to go in front of those men the way that the king asked her to do that, and she said no. And we never, whenever we get to the end of this, we never hear about Vashti as queen again after this. Now, we're not going to meet Esther in chapter 1, and after chapter 1, Vashti she's gone. She's out of the picture. Before the courage of Esther could take place, we had to have the courage of Vashti. Now, it's probably known that Vashti and King Xerxes were not followers of our Lord God. But, we as Christians can look at this in a way like, okay, so we have the breath of God in us. God has breathed life into us. And we have to use that, His breath in our lungs, we have to use that in the best way possible. And sometimes we are asked to do things that we have to say no to. Maybe it's going to be easier to say yes and just go along with it. And a lot of people may say, well, Vashti had to obey her husband. And we might look at that even in a Christian marriage. Wives are supposed to obey their husbands, except when there comes a situation when God's law is above that of a husband's, right? So we have to use the voice of God, the breath of God that we have in us for the right things. And sometimes that's going to be to say no. And I just love that Vashti is like, no, I'm not having any of this. I'm not going in front of a bunch of drunk men. And I know I may die for this, and I'm going to maybe lose my position, but I'm saying no to this. This is so degrading to me. I could go on and on about this, but we have to do the right things, even if it's saying no. Okay, verses 13 through 15. Then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And the next unto him was Carshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? So the king was counseled by wise men who knew all about law and judgment, and he wanted to know what he could do to Vashti to punish her, because she said no to him. Verses 16 through 18. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes, and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported that the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please... Okay, we're going to stop there. So Memucan is counseling the king, and he says that not only has Vashti done this to you, but now she's done this to all men, because when the other women hear about the disobedience of Vashti, that she did not obey her husband and king, now all the women are going to start disobeying their husbands. So this is what this man is telling the king. Like, she not only went against you, she went against all of the men of Persia, because now all of our wives are going to disobey because you couldn't control yours. So this is what the man is saying in the ear of the king. Verse 19. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. So he is saying, let there be a decree made saying Vashti can no longer come before you, king, and she's also not allowed to be queen anymore, and we're going to give her position to someone better. So the king should have honored his wife's dignity, not to come before all of those men that were drunk or drinking. He should have never put her in that position. And now he is taking advice from these men that are saying, toss your wife and queen aside and bring in someone better. Someone better as in bring in someone that will do what you say, that will do as you command, because this woman has too much of a voice, pretty much is what they're saying. Okay, verse 20. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. So the decree will be sent out throughout all of the land, and all the wives will know you better honor your husbands. They're essentially saying, if you don't obey, this could happen to you. Verse 21. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. So the king does as that man suggests. In verse 22, for he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. So it is sent out, the decree is sent out everywhere. This is law. This is what happened because Vashti disobeyed, and he took a personal matter and he turned it into a national event, pretty much. Everyone knows Vashti has disobeyed, and now she is queen no longer. So that is the end of Esther chapter 1, and I'm so excited for chapter 2.